this computer. Okay, awesome. So, hey everyone, welcome to week 8, day 1 of Echo. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about HTTP clients, and more specifically, how we can get things from websites. So if you guys remember last week, you guys talked a little bit about APIs, how to call them, and how we use Postman. Today is going to be building off of that just a little bit. And we're going to talk about how we can use APIs, cURL, and some other features in order to basically make our web applications, I guess you could say, less static. So there's a useful utility that we have. Here, let me go to my notes document. There we go. Called the cURL or cURL functionality, which basically lets you get stuff from websites. So if we want to play with an example of how this works, we can all go to something called example.com. So it's literally www.example.com. And let me change my screen share so you guys can see what this website looks like. It just looks like a normal, simple little website. It says it's an example domain. You can click this for more information. There's really not a lot of code or scripting involved here, and we can open up our elements and say, okay, it's got like a header. That's really simple. It's got a body, etc. But what if I wanted to get the code of this website without going to the website in my browser? What if there was a way that I could get get details of not just the code of this website, but also look into what commands are being run and how this website is being accessed from my own computer? And this is where the curl functionality really comes in handy. So if you go to your terminal and we type in curl and then the name of the website, so in this case, it's going to be example.com. I'm going to open up my terminal, and you can see here, when I run this curl command, I essentially get all of the code of that website. Why is it doing this? Well, the simple answer is because the curl operator, that when we run it like this, basically does the equivalent of running an API or like a Postman get command. So if I were to say, hey, I want to get whatever is at this address, it's going to return all of the HTML that gets returned from that address. And that's basically what the curl operator does in its simplest form. Now, we can do that for other websites too. You can do the same thing for Google. You can do the same thing for basically any website that is on the web. But curl has some more features than just this. Another thing you can do is you can run your own copy on your own machine. So for that, we could say, for example, let me make sure I'm in my demos folder. I can say curl www.example.com. And let's say that I wanted to download a copy of this website on my own computer just for my personal use. Well, that's where this little arrow sign comes in handy. This is a symbol that we're going to see a little bit, that and the less than symbol of more later on in 2 or 3 weeks with. But basically, this is used in order to transfer data, I guess, into or out of a file. So in this case, what I'm saying is, hey, I want to get everything in example.com and then push it to some file that we'll just say this is like example site.html. So if I run this, it now shows us this handy little screen. It says the percent total. It says that we had 100% of this website or this thing residing at example.com that was received. It's now been pushed to my computer. I can see that I have an example site.html right here. And if I scroll down, we see here that, well, I have a basically exact copy of example.com residing on my computer. So there's a few other things. I'm going to delete this file because we obviously don't need it. There's a few other things that we can do with curl. So we can look at the headers that are being accessed. So if you guys remember from the API lecture, that when we run get or set or get data from an API or send data or fetch or whatever command you run, you have to send in a request header, and then whatever comes back to you comes back as a API response header. So using curl, we can also get those from this website. So if we go up and we went back to this, and our basic format for all curl commands is going to be curl and then the thing you're trying to access. And then inside we can add some flags. So here we'll add in the /v flag, which basically says, all right, I want this to be a verbose output. Or when I run this website, I want you to tell me everything that happens when I run it. So as we can see here, it gives us all of the headers. So it says that it's first trying to connect. We see that these are all the ports that the address of the website essentially. So it now says, all right, I've connected to this website on port 80. Then it's going to say, all right, well, this is a website and I'm not sending it any data. I just need to get data back. So I want to get data using the HTTP protocol. I want to run it on this host and the user agent. So curl, again, just like Postman, is going to be a user agent. That's curl has a version. And then thankfully, we get a 200 flag. And the 200 code basically means, as it says here, okay. Now, there are other ones, like the most common are 400, 403, and 404, and other flags that basically mean it wasn't okay. But if you see a 200, you're generally pretty good. Then we have a bunch of other data. So we have like the age of the call. Not quite sure what the case control is. You have content type, which is pretty obvious. It tells you that the operation that you're running from this host is returning an HTML text to you. This is the character set that it's defined in. It gives you the date of the request. It tells you when the request expired. Let's see what else. And then it'll just give you, the content length or however much stuff is in there. And then we just have all of our HTML code. And then afterwards, it says that the connection has been left intact. So we didn't destroy the website, essentially. And we can reconnect to it if we need to. That's the main part of how curl works. There's a few other things that we can talk about. Like there's a way to, for example, dump all of this into a special file that has, there's a way to dump all of this into a file that also has individual byte by byte transfers. But that's not something I think we'll need to talk about tonight. So before I move on, are there any questions about curl in the meantime?
Is this how you go about scraping data from a website or no?
Yes and no. So you can use it to scrape data from a website. You'll often see people do use curl to do that, but personally, I would use a dedicated Python library to do the same thing. It's just it's a little bit easier. But I mean, curl will basically give you the simplest, the most basic web scraping thing, at least when you put it in the terminal, because I mean, it gives you the entire code of your HTML page, right there. You can put that into a file like we did when we downloaded the whole thing, and you can scrape from that. I know that Python has some utilities that I've used in the past. I just don't remember what they are off the top of my head, but that is probably what I would suggest in addition to default or not default, but Beautify or other Python scraper libraries. So you can use it, but there's easier ways to do it.
Cool.
Any other questions?
Is there any website that you can use curl
on? Well, one example would probably be just a website that you're running on your computer or a website running on somebody else's computer. So if it's not running on the internet, you can't use curl because again, curl will put a get request out to this website. Another example is, at least not in the default form, you probably wouldn't be able to use curl to get to a website that needs authentication. So like if you have to log in using a username and password to get into a website, or if it relies on like browser cookies for authentication and stuff, you would have to modify curl a little bit in order to insert like a header into that. I don't have any examples off the top of my head right now, but like that's a case, for example, where Postman makes it a little bit more visually easy to do that than curl. Those are probably the two cases where you wouldn't really use curl, in my personal opinion.
Gotcha, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit today about APIs, but also well, I know last time on, I think Saturday, you guys talked a lot about how to use APIs with Postman. Well, today we're going to talk about how to use APIs within HTML. So let me go ahead and clear my terminal. That's done. And let's go back for HTML demo. So today's exercise, which if you guys would like to code along with me, you're more than welcome to, either by following the screen or by going to today's README. So today's goal is to create a website that enables us to view exchange rates. So we'll just call this like exchange rate website. There we go. So obviously we need to have a couple of key components. The first thing that we'll need to have is a way for users to select a base currency. And then we also need a way for users to see all the other currencies relative to it. So this is like the main feature of our website. So we'll need to find a way for users to have a base currency and to see every other currency that they need to see. So to start things off, let's start by code. What I like to do is start coding the HTML and then bring in the JavaScript and the CSS after. So how do I start an HTML document? Like, what's the first thing I need to type?
Exclamation point, enter.
Yeah, so we'll say doc type, and then we'll say HTML. Is there anything else I need to put in there before I do my HTML tags, or am I good to go?
You mean like the head and all of that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I usually just do the boilerplate, like the exclamation point tab, and get the generic one.
Could do that, but it's also never a bad idea to write it out from scratch, especially at this point, because trust me, you guys are going to be using that boilerplate a lot coming forward. But sure, you're more than welcome to do that. But right now, I'm just going to code it out bit by bit, just to make sure that we all understand what's going on. So we open things up with the HTML and /HTML tags, again, because the HTML opens the whole HTML doc, /HTML closes it. And we can do whatever we need to do inside of these tags. So we now need to put in a header, and we also ought to have a body. So inside of our header, we should probably put a title. So we can say this is like my exchange rate website. We should also probably link to our styling and our JavaScript. Even though we haven't used those yet, we are going to very soon. So remind me, how do I link to CSS and how do I link to a JavaScript script?
It should be link rel equals a style sheet, and then href to your styling.css.
styling.css. Okay, and do I need to write anything after that or close this tag in some way, or am I good to leave it as it is?
You get to leave it as is.
All right, perfect. So that's the styling done, or linked to at least. Now, what about the JavaScript? How do I link to that?
Correct.
Okay, so we'll say script.
Source and then your JS demo.js.
Perfect. And
You close
now
it
for
in there.
yeah, so for the difference between link and script, which is important, is the link one does not require you to close it, but script does require you to close this off. So that's kind of important. All right, so we've got our HTML, we've got our header, we've imported our style sheet, we've imported our script. So now it's time to make our body. So we might as well open it up by putting in some H1 tags and saying like exchange rates. It's probably good enough. And now we need a way to do these two things. So I'll go ahead and paste my comments down here. So first, I need a way for users to select a currency. What are some tools in HTML that we can use that would help our users select something?
Maybe like a select tag with options.
Perfect. That sounds good to me. So we'll have a select tag, and we can put stuff in that. But generally, I like to also add in a label for everything before I start adding in my selects. So for this one, we could say like choose currency. I think it's like a base currency. And now for our select, what can we do? How do I add options? Well, I can just type option, and then each option needs to have a value. So we can have like a blank option for starters. We can have, let's say, another value for USD, and then this one's going to have a USD inside it. And we can add in a value for like euros, and then put in EUR. And we can also put in, oh, that should have an equal sign. Let's do the Great British Pound. Why not? And we can say GBP. Okay, so we've got my label and I've got my select statement made. Now, how do I link the label to the select statement? Because right now, this is a label for who knows what, and the select statement for who knows what. How can I say this label goes with the select statement?
Is it a for keyword?
Yep, so we're going to put a for keyword in the label. And if we read about what this says, it says the ID of a labelable form-related element in the same document as a label field. And it should have a matching ID matching the value of the for attribute. So if we go ahead and we say that the for attribute here, we could call this one currency. And now what do I do with my select? So I've created a label, which is great, but our label isn't doing anything because we haven't pointed it anywhere.
You create an ID for currency.
Okay, so how do I create an ID?
So just type in ID equals and then currency.
Yes, we'll say ID equals currency. Is there anything else that I need to do? Yeah, there shouldn't be. But also, just to maintain some redundancy, we'll also just give this guy a name, and we'll say that the name of this is going to be currency as well. And yeah, we can keep the ID as the same. Or actually, here, let's change this to selector because that's what this thing actually is. And yeah, that should work. So So we now have a way for our users to select our base currency. So let's go ahead and save this. And let me go ahead and pop this open in my browser. Once I find my browser, where did you go? Okay, let's go here. This is not the day for my computer to be running slowly. There we go. Okay, perfect. So, oh, forgot to update the share. Okay, so we should now, everybody should have a website that looks something roughly like this. So we've got our, oop, that's not it. We've got our exchange rates. It says choose a base currency, and we have blank, we have USD, EUR, and GBP. So pretty simple. Now, again, we can see that our HTML shows up here. We've got our style sheet linked, our script linked, and in our body, it's wonderful how we have this nice little label and a select. But how can I actually correlate the select, what I've selected here, with some user output? That's the whole problem that we're trying to solve. And now this is where part 2 of this comes in. So here again, we've mentioned that we can select our option. That's great. But we also need a way for users to see all the other currencies that we're trying to display by taking in this guy. So the way we can do that is by just making a nice little empty div. So we can say like div ID. Now, usually for a div IDs, you want to keep their IDs somewhat generic. Container is generally one that's used a lot just because it's nice and broad. You can also make it more specific and say this is like container for like currencies or something like that. But we only have one div in this whole thing. So I'm just going to keep it called div ID equals container. So we don't need to do anything in our styling.css unless you guys would like to style stuff. Do you guys want to practice any CSS styling before we move on to the JavaScript and APIs part, or not really?
Nah.
Okay, fair enough. All right, so in that case, what I'm gonna do real quick is I'm gonna go back to my browser, and where'd the week 8 day one, just so we can have a pretty style sheet. I'm going to copy paste in the style sheet from the README because it looks a little bit better than what we have right now. And we can just run through it real fast. So you've got your body. I'm saying that everything is going to be career and new. It's going to be career and monospace. I've got a container, which is the div ID, which has hashtag container in it. Oop. And I'm going to say that the background color of this is going to be this off-white. It's going to be everything there. I want it displayed as a grid, and I have these things in columns of 5. Then for each item, which we haven't defined yet, we'll have each item is basically going to be a box. You know what? Let me comment these out for now, since we don't need that. And then this part is for basically the screen that we're going to develop at the end. So again, this one has a container in it. And actually, sorry, this one is, if you take a look at it, it says app media screen and max width is 1,000 pixels. This is basically for iPhones or super tiny screens. So why is it important to have this? So if we go up here to our regular hashtag container, we see that I've set it so that the grid template has basically rows of 5 items in it. So I'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, iPhone screens are like this tiny. So if you put 5 things in a row on an iPhone screen, it's going to look absolutely terrible. So what this part does down here is it basically says, all right, I want to double check how big my screen width is. If my screen width is smaller than 1,000 pixels, if I can't fit 1,000 pixels onto it, then I'm going to revise my div container to only have 1 item per column. So instead of it being 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaced out super tightly, it's just 1, 1, 1, 1, etc. So we can keep that included for now. But unless there are any questions about the CSS, we're gonna jump into talking about the APIs. Are there any questions about the CSS? Okay, great. So if not, let's move on to figuring out how on earth I'm going to get my data from, into my HTML document. Well, the nice, easy thing that we can do to get our data is find an open source API, of which thankfully there are a bunch. And the one that we're going to be using today is called W8D1 So they have a bunch of, so again, we can go to access their documentation, which is great that they have documentation. A lot of APIs have terrible documentation. This one has decent ones. And we'll basically just scroll through until we find what we need. So you've got your VAT validation. We don't actually care about that. We have currency rates, which is exactly what we're looking for. That tracks foreign exchange references published by them. That's okay. And we can get the latest rates using this get command, which is exactly what we're looking for. So now one other thing to keep in mind here is this is where the parameters of our curl or the parameters of our get come in handy. So if we look at the default call that we can make to this API to get the rates, it says https api.thatcomply.com/rates. But it says the default is going to be this base in euros every single time. What if instead of getting the base in euros, I need to get the base in dollars, or I need to get the base in yen or some other thing? Well, that's where the next part of the API comes in handy, which is where we can modify our get call to say rates and then put an optional parameter with the question mark that specifies that the base that I want is now, say, US dollars or Great British pounds or whatever other unit of currency we're using. And then that goes and gets put in the base right here. So the nice thing about this API that Chad provided is the documentation is super simple. There's only like a couple of things that we can look at. So like you can have, your visitor's country. I mean, there's really like what, 6, 7 options, which is great. And they're all on the same page. Some other websites or APIs will have like literally hundreds of subcommands that you will have to go digging through to find, which is something that hopefully all of you guys are going to experience in a bit less than 2 hours. But until then, we don't need to worry too much about that. So now that we have our data, how can I pull this data from my that comply API website into my code? So let's go down to this guy and figure out what's going on when we run this. So I'm going to go back just because we used curl earlier. We're going to keep using curl for a little bit. So I'm going to say that I want to curl this website and get the base price with USD. And as you can see here, we get this very lovely output. Does anybody remember what file type this output is, or what type of output this is?
JSON?
Yes, this is JSON. So it's something that we're going to deal with more and more over the coming weeks, but knowing that is important for when we actually start using the data coming in, which is what we're going to do tonight. So what's one thing that's important about JSON? JSON is all key value pairs. That's literally all this is. You see, date corresponds to the date. Base corresponds to this. Rates corresponds to, well, a giant list of more key value pairs. So all JSON is, again, it's a JavaScript object. There's a few other letters in there that I do not remember, but basically JSON is a JavaScript serialized object. It turns whatever thing you have in JavaScript, your JavaScript class, and turns it into a file, and vice versa. So this entire thing is really easy for JavaScript to interpret on its own. which is perfect. So before we move on to actually using curl, first I just want to make sure to using the API. First, I want to make sure that I can, run all my API calls okay. So we can go ahead and run the verbose call on this, just so we can look at what's happening, and we see now that there is a lot more stuff than we got before. So the difference between, so if we go back to running our curl verbose example.com, our example.com run was really simple. All it did was it says, all right, I've connected to it. I'm going to run this GET request. It was okay. Here's a bit of unimportant stuff for us right now. And here's the website. Boom, we're done. Now, if we were to try and do the exact same thing for our currency, we see there's a lot more stuff going on in the background. Not all of which is important, but a good bit of it is. So what is it doing? Well, the first thing, if we start from the top, is that it tries to access the API website. It tries to first go to api.thatcomply.com, and it's able to connect to it, which is great. It says that the server offers HTTP, and it accepts it, so we're using the HTTP protocol, and now is where it runs the GET command. So it's not just getting the base website, it's getting the rates, number one, which is our first parameter. And the second parameter in our GET request is that it wants to get all the rates with the USD base. So again, if you were to go into Postman, you would modify your GET request to have this built into it. After that, let's see, what else does it do? It sets up a SSL network connection. It checks that the connection's okay. And then after that, it has a bunch of information, because again, this is an API. So when we're getting stuff, we're not just getting the code back from the website. It has to go through a bunch of authentication procedures first. So it's got things like, we're not allowed to access the origin of this code. Like, for example, we can't access the web server that all of this is behind. Let's see, what other things are there? These are all of the endpoints of our URL. So this is basically what tells us where the data is coming from. It tells us that all of the data is stored on a Cloudflare server. And that's about it in terms of the stuff that there is one other thing. So if we go back to our example.html, when we return stuff with our HTTP, we see here that it has content type as text class HTML, and it has a character set. If we go down to this guy, we see here that the content type of the API return is an application, and it's returning JSON. So the big difference between just running a GET command on like a normal website versus an API is that your API is going to return JSON to you, while your regular website is just going to return HTML. Also, in general, when you're getting stuff from an API or putting stuff onto an API, there are a lot more calls in here. We're not going to get into these in significant detail yet, but when we get to our Django unit, probably in about a month or so, that's where we'll start to, and especially with our Django and React units, that's where we're really starting to start delving into things like, what on earth does allow origin actually mean? Why do we need to allow credentials to be true, etc.? But we won't talk about that stuff right now. But basically, this is just reinforcing the notion that, again, curl is just giving you a GET HTTP request, and you can custom set your headers by setting them in the string of your URL. So that was a lot at once. Do you guys have any questions about all of this or any of this stuff that's being returned from curl before we talk about how we can access our API using JavaScript?
Is when we use curl, I guess like if the API did have a key, like would it still just work if we would just have to format like the GET request essentially to like match properly, and like Postman just makes that easier and prettier?
Pretty much. So with curl, you are able to set custom headers. So if your API had a key, like you said, you in your curl statement, you would be able to specify the key that you're using in a custom header. But I mean, as you can see, the output of curl looks really ugly, and so does the input. Let's be honest, command line isn't the prettiest. So applications like Postman and other things allow you to, they basically do the exact same thing as curl, but just prettier. So you're able to do the same things, but just in a slightly different way. Any other questions? All right, so if not, let's start writing some JavaScript. So the first thing that we want to establish is what are the parts of our JavaScript file that we need to create. So if we go back to our HTML, okay, let me go back to browser, there we go. And we go back to our website. This is our website. It does absolutely nothing. So what is our website supposed to do? Or what is a user supposed to see when they go to our website? Well, they should see this form, which is great. They should be able to click an option. And when they click an option, they should be able to see updated exchange rate information come up. Obviously, none of that's happening because we haven't put in anything interactive to respond to user input. So if we go back to our VS Code, our JavaScript needs to have a couple of key features. Number one, it needs, so things we need to code. First thing we need is a way to get user input. What currency did they select? Then, or what base currency did they select? Then we also need a way to output all exchange rates based on user input base currency. And I think that's basically about it in terms of things we need to code. So let's start things off by talking about when do we want our JavaScript to be run? Ideally, we want to have our JavaScript code run the moment somebody opens the website. Because the moment that I open that website, I want the ability to be able to click in that form field and click USD or GBP or whatever unit of currency I want and have all of this stuff happen. So, does anyone remember what the JavaScript code is to have something run the moment I open or the moment I load a web page?
Is it unload?
It is, yes. So, no, how do I tell JavaScript to do it on load? So I can't just type on load like this.
It was window.
Unmuted. It's a window unload.
Yeah, perfect. I think to me what you're getting at the exact same thing. But yeah, it's typing window.onload. So if we go window.onload, we can just use a nice little fat arrow function. And okay, so now we can do all of our stuff inside here. So we can say run all this as soon as I open the web page. Okay, so we need to now write in at least a couple of functions. So the first thing that I'm going to need to do is figure out how I'm going to get my user input. So we can say function to get user input. We need a way to turn user input into an API call. We then, once we get this JSON back from the API, obviously JSON is not HTML. So we need to turn API return JSON into HTML stuff. And then lastly, we need to put HTML stuff on our web page. So these are basically the 4 components that we have to have. So what I want to happen is, somebody goes to this website, they click one of these options. When they click one of those options, my web page first recognizes, ding, ding, you clicked an option. Then it's going to say, all right, I know what you've clicked. Once it figures out what the user clicked, it's going to say, all right, I know what it's clicked. I know which option I need to pick. I'm going to write my API call and say in my API header, hey, this user picked a certain base currency. Keep that in mind. Once I call my API, I need to get my data back from the API, but that's in this really yucky JSON format. So I need to turn that JSON format into something in HTML. And once I get that HTML back, there's not really a point to the HTML just living in this JavaScript file. I need to push that from the JavaScript file to my HTML web page so that the user can actually see. So whenever we call an API, it's most of the time we're going to follow essentially this exact process where you call the API usually based off of user input. That gets turned into your API call into somewhere in the headers. Then you call the API, it returns you stuff. You need to figure out what to do with that stuff. In this case, we're turning it into HTML. And then you need to figure out, once you either turn it directly into HTML or run some other functions or something with it, turn whatever stuff you're going to put into HTML and put that on your web page. So this is basically the gist of what we're going to be doing. All right. So, I guess we can start off by talking about what things in our HTML page we need to talk about. So the things that are important for us right now are going to be essentially the thing that's selected and our div. So the reason I inserted a div in here is because the div is going to be where all of our currency information gets pushed. So we should probably add in a variable or something that stores the contents of our div. So how can I do that? How can I tell JavaScript, hey, I have a div that's called container, reference this in JavaScript. What do I need to do?
A query selector.
Okay, perfect. So Tyler, walk me through that. What is a query selector? How do I set it up?
So you can give it a name. So I guess we'll just make it name container so we can interact with it once we have it. You'll let that
Sure.
equal document dot query selector.
Okay.
When you made the container, did you give it a class or an ID?
Let's see. Here it
ID?
looks like it was an ID.
So we'll want to do a hashtag. Well, actually, yeah, quotations, hashtag container. And that'll call upon the ID container that you created in the HTML.
Perfect. Nicely done. Thanks, Tyler. So yeah, so walking through this from the start, as you said, we're setting up a variable called container. Now, what the query selector does is it basically says, I guess the document part first. The document part says, all right, I know that I've imported my JavaScript file using the script src equals tag. That obviously means JavaScript is being run in some sort of HTML document. Whatever document it is that runs this file, that is the same thing that this document tag refers to. And then query selector basically says, I want to search through this whole document and find the thing that has the ID of container, and then put it and its contents and its reference inside of this constant. We can do exactly the same thing. We're not going to call that one container. We can do exactly the same thing for our selector, which is the select statement. So we can say selector, and then we'll just replace this with the selector tag. So with this, I guess we can just say these are our HTML placeholders for now, if we want to just break down what each thing is. Okay, so we have our HTML placeholders. So now I need to figure out how I can grab my HTML element and check, what it is. So how can I check? How can I check if selector, which if you remember, selector is the thingy that we're selecting. How can I check if this has changed? Because that's the first function that we want to write.
Would it be like selector dot value or something?
We could use that, but that would only give us the value of the selector. What I need to do is I need to figure out if selector has changed.
Hmm.
Can we use an event listener here or?
Bingo. Yes. So the exact purpose of an event listener is to tell you 99% of the time you'll use them to figure out if something has changed. So what we can do is we can type selector.add event listener. And you can see here there's a bunch of information about event listeners. So basically, an event listener will listen for an event that you specify. It sounds kind of silly, but that's essentially what happens. Yeah, this doesn't tell us anything else that's helpful. But we can add in an event listener, and then we can say the type of event listener. So we can say the type of event listener in this case is going to be a change. Basically, we're just saying, does the value selected change? If it does change, and then we need to do a bunch of stuff. So the way that we set up an event listener is by, once again, including a fat arrow function inside it. JavaScript really likes its fat arrow functions. So once we get our event listener, we need to run a function that happens. This could either be like hinting that something happened or running a console log or something like that. So in this case, I'm going to say that my event or the thing that's changed, or I'm going to refer to this as E. And we're going to take E as an input, and I'm going to add in some opening and closing curly brackets, because remember, this at the end of the day is a fat arrow function. And what I want to do for right now, just so we can see how this works, is we can console log, hey, or that wasn't supposed to happen, changed the form. That should probably do it. So if I go ahead and save this, and we'll go back to my browser in here, we'll refresh this guy, and if I click this, we see here, when I click USD, it says, hey, I changed the form. If I click euros, it also says I changed the form. And GBP, it says I changed the form, and so on. So this is the way our event handler works, again, is it listens, in our case, it listens for a change in the value of selector. If that value changes, it's going to run whatever's inside of our fat arrow function. So we can go back here, we set in our fat arrow function to console log that we changed the form, and that we have a functional event listener. Now, obviously, we need a way to actually get the input from our event listener. So the way we can do that is by referencing this little guy, E. So, I do want to save this. So let's go ahead and console log E and figure out what on earth that thing actually is. So we can go back to our website. I'm going to refresh it and clear it out. And I now switched it to USD. And we see that the E that I just set in my event listener is not a string or of an integer or something like that. It is a type of event that gets returned. And we see here, it gives us a bunch of data, but specifically, the things that we want to pay attention to are target and type. So the type of event that just happened is a change event. How do I know this? Well, because I told the event listener to listen for a change event. And the target of this is select, which is a selector. Or specifically, as you can see, it's when I mice over this, it gets highlighted as the little dropdown. So we can look inside of our target, And this has a lot of different properties. Now, we don't need to really pay attention to most of these, but what I'm looking for is the value field. And the value field basically tells us what has been selected or what thing is the value of our select statement with ID of selector. So what I want to do now is I need to get E dot. So remember that E has a target, which again, if we go up all the way here, the target of E is our select hashtag selector, which is this little guy up here. And I now need to get out the value of this. Oh, well, yeah, E isn't defined because we aren't in the function. But the way that we can get whatever's changed, the value of the thingy inside of there, is by, well, now we have access to E. So I'm going to go to my target, which is our select field, and I'm going to get the value of that target, which is, in this case, USD. So if we go back to our JavaScript demos, and instead, if I now log e.target.value, and we hit save, we go back to our exchange rate website, we close it and rerun it, and I go to USD. Ta-da! We now see that USD is a thing that our value has been changed to. And now it changed back to blank. And if I want to change it again, it's now changed to euros. And it's now changed to GBP. And it's now changed back to euros and back to USD. So the way that we can relate in real time something changing in our HTML page to our JavaScript is by using an event listener like this. Are there any questions about how the event listener works before we move on to the next bits? Okay, so we'll go back to the demos. And before I continue, I just want to make sure that everything makes sense so far. And number two, for those coding along on your own computers, if anyone is everything that you guys are doing lining up with the stuff that I'm getting in my output? Are there any questions, or is anybody getting unexpected results or anything like that?
Yeah, like how come if you console.log e.target, it doesn't like have value in the console, you know? I don't
Oh,
know
so you
how to
mean like here?
Yeah,
Like if I just
yeah.
did. Well, the reason for that it doesn't know what the target is
Yeah, like
automatically.
if you run that in the if you go back to the web page,
Mhm.
like click
Let me-
USD.
Here, let me try that. So you're saying like this?
Yeah, like I thought like if you click that arrow, like oh yeah, like mhm.
Oh, it doesn't tell you like which one is selected?
I don't know. I don't remember my question.
It's all good. No, you're all good. But to walk through it again, so here, let me go back to, here, let me just share my screen at this point. It's probably easier than splitting between the windows. There, okay, actually, that was a terrible idea. Here, I'll just keep this one a little bit bigger, so now everything isn't squished. So if we were to just console log E, which is, again, our overall event, and I go back here and I refresh this, we go click USD. E itself is an event. I can go into my event and I can get the target. And the target here is a specific HTML element. The target I'm selecting is the select name equals currency and ID is selector. So that target itself does have a value, which we can scroll down and see that value in here. So we can say e.target.value, and it'll say, give me the value of this select statement with ID selector, and it'll say, ta-da, the value you've selected is USD. However, if I go back and I now say, e.target like this, which is what you were saying, I believe, and I go back here and I just hit USD, we now just get the HTML element that corresponds to it, which is again is this guy. So the reason that if we go back to the code for a second, so remember E itself is a JavaScript event object, but the target of E is an HTML element. So the target itself, when we run it like that in the console, we can't access the value of it when just outputting the target as HTML. We have to type in the dot value or to see the value directly, or we can see it when we just run E and then do the thing that I mentioned. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah,
Okay, awesome. What other questions do y'all have? Okay, so would you guys like to keep going for a little bit and then take a break in 10 or 15 minutes? Or would you guys rather take a short break now and then we come back and blaze through the remaining half hour to an hour of lecture, like all in one go? It's up to you guys.
We can keep going.
Okay, anybody opposed to that? Okay, if you are, well, you know, if not, we'll keep going then. So we've now written up our function that gets the user input as we just demonstrated. So again, by adding in an event listener, we can figure out, hey, something changed in my web page. What thing changed? The thing that changed is E. Now, what did the change to? We can get the target dot value, and that tells us what our thing has changed to. So let me go ahead and give myself a variable for the thing that has changed. And we can say, what's a good variable name? We can say like base selected. Yeah, that's probably good. Is going to be e.target.value. And then we can console log base selected. Nice and simple. All right. So right now, though, we can't do anything with our selected value. And that's because the only way we can actually do something with it is when we turn our user input into an API call. So let's go back to, oh, let me see. You guys can still see my screen, right? Okay, cool. So let's go back to our API. And remember here that the call that we need to make is a get with the HTTP protocol of this link. So I'm going to go back to my VS Code and I'm going to add in another comment because I like to use my comments to break out sections. And we can say that this is like API base URLs. So for this one, we can call this currencies API base. So that just basically says really easily, hey, I have an API called currencies API, and this is the base URL of it. And I'm going to copy paste my link in. Now, we don't need all of this information. The one thing we want to remove is this equals USD part. Why do we want to remove that? Well, because we want the base to be flexible. We want the base to be the value that this person has chosen. That value could be USD, it could be GBP, it could be EUR, it could be insert other three-letter currency. So we want to keep that bit a little bit flexible. So the URL base that we want to access is going to be the API base link / rates, because remember, we want the rates. And then we're going to leave the parameter for base optional, or we're going to leave it out for now. We're going to change that very, very shortly. Okay, so we've got our user input, which is awesome. But now I need to figure out how to turn my user input into an API call. So for that, I need to start writing a function. So for this one, what I'm going to say is I'm going to create a function. What do I want to call it? Yeah, we'll call it make request. So we can say this is going to be called make request, and we're going to say that this is going to be an async or an asynchronous function. And now this function is going to take in our user input and it's going to turn it into an API call. So we want to take in our user input, so we can say like user base, and we need to now use a fat arrow function to turn this into a function. All right. So, and also while I'm here, we might as well just say that we're going to run make request with our user base equal to base selected. Okay, so I've got my function template written out. How do I actually, use my URL, use this URL that we have for a base plus the user input? Well, we basically just need to create a new URL for API call, fetch that or wait for the get request to return us data, and we're basically done. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to say that we need to have a API call URL. So this API call URL is going to be our currency's API base URL plus our user base. Why does this work? So remember, our currency's API base is going to be the thing that we call without the specific 3-letter identifier that our user has to select. And if you'll remember, the form options are USD, EUR, and GBP, which are all things that we can input directly to our currency's API as the base currency. So the full API call that we can run should be currency's API base plus user base. And just to confirm this, why don't we go ahead and console log the URL? I'm going to go ahead and take that off, and we'll go back here, refresh it. And just for right now, let's say that I'm going to USD. We can click this link, and we see here that indeed we do get a valid JSON output with base of USD, and it gives us all of our rates with the base of USD. And I can do the same thing and verify this works for EUR. I'm just printing out the link right now and not running it. But when I click it, we see here I get something with the base in euros, and it says here that euros are 1-to-1 with euros. So this is a nice, quick way to verify that the API call URL that we've written up actually works. So now that we've written up our URL, in the console, we were practicing using cURLs. Well, right now we're going to use a special function called fetch, which basically it'll run a fetch API to make this request for us. It basically does the same thing as curl in our situation. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to create a constant, and we're going to say that this guy is called the result, which is going to be the result of our API call. And we're going to say that the result is going to wait until we are able to fetch from our URL. So we're going to say that this is going to fetch from API call URL. And why don't we go ahead and console log our result while we're here? So we can go back to the console, run this. I can go here and go down one. Whoa, I'm getting a weird object. So the thing that's returned after we do an await fetch is not the JSON that we get back automatically. So remember when we just ran curl and how we got all this nice JSON back with the date and the base and all that? Not the case when we run the fetch API. Instead, we get a JavaScript response object back. And that has a lot of stuff. It tells you the type of headers that were used, the status of the request. It tells you the URL that was queried. It tells you the headers that were passed along. It also tells you about the body, which we currently, well, let's be honest, this is not an easy format to read things in. And it gives us a ton of information, sure, but we can't actually process anything in our response other than the fact that our results status was 200, which means it was okay. So if we wanted to, we could console log the result status. That's something I like to do whenever I make an API call, just to make sure that it's always 200. If it's ever not 200, that means it didn't work. So I just like to have that console logged. If you want to later on, when you are, error checking, what you could do is you could say like if, and then say result dot status equals 200, and then you could do whatever things you need to do. If it wasn't, then you could return an error message or console log or something like that. We won't be doing that right now, but that is a stretch goal that you guys can implement if you'd like to, for when you guys design your own APIs tonight, or if API calls tonight. So we've checked, we can get our response, we're going to get our result back, but the result is going to be a JavaScript response object with results of running fetch. Now that's awesome, but result doesn't actually tell us anything helpful. So what we need to do is get the JSON back from our result. So we'll set up a new value and we'll call this result JSON. And we're now going to wait for the result dot, and we have a bunch of different things we can get from this, right? I can get the URL, I can get the type, I can get the text from the return. What I want to do is get the JSON from this. And we're also going to just console log my result JSON. So if we go back here, we rerun this, I go to USD, we see here, now this has no known errors, and ta-da, we get a very lovely little bit of JSON. It tells us the base currency that was used, the date that was used, and all the rates we could ever care about, which is exactly what we're looking for. So we now have our JSON. So what I can say is that this turns result response into JSON object. And now the last thing that we can do is if we go back here, we don't really care about the base currency anymore because we know that. We don't care about the date, but what we do care about are all the rates. So I'm going to go ahead and console log this, or remove those console logs. And what we're going to say is constant all the rates that we care about is result JSON, and then just give me all the rates that are included. So this is how we can take our user input. Again, we're taking that as an input to make request. That user input is getting turned into a part of our API call URL. We're fetching data from that URL, but that's a response object. So we need to turn that yucky response object into JSON. And then from the JSON, we don't care about everything in the JSON. We just need the rates. And then we can pull that out at the end of the day. Any questions about the make request function before there's two more functions that we need to write? So any questions about any of the two parts that we've done so far?
How come you can define variables without using const or let?
So const and let basically help you to protect or define the variable. I guess it's generally good practice to actually define them with let or const. I probably should do that. But in JavaScript, you are allowed to define variables without those.
On your event listener, how come you open the parentheses before change, but it doesn't get closed until after all the function, like the entire function. Yeah.
Ah, good question. So that's the way that event listener works. So when here, let's go and type this. So we have select the add event listener, and I'll open the parentheses and show you what things it needs me to input. Nope, let me, no, there we go. So we need to input a couple of things. So the first thing it says is you need to input the type of event, and then you need to input a listener. So the type of event is that string that was, in our case, change. And then listener is the function that gets run whenever you have that event fire off. So in this case, I had to custom define a listener function, which is this 2-line function right here. It takes in that event, and then it gets in the selected base and makes the request. Now, what I could do is I could, define this function separately outside and then call it, but it's just easier to define it using a fat arrow function. So essentially, I could replace all this with like mystery function, and that would still be fun. But in our specific case here, it's generally when you're using an event listener, it's best practice to use a fat arrow function inside of it. Like so, which does result in it being slightly yucky where the parentheses only get closed after the function, but it is what it is.
Yeah, you can kind of think of it as like a pre-built method in JavaScript. So basically you're calling a function on selector. I don't know if that
Exactly.
kind of helps you think about it.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
Any other questions I can help answer before we move on to the last two functions? All right, so we got two more functions and then we'll take a short break. So the next thing that we need to do is, well, I need to figure out how I'm going to turn my API return JSON into, well, into HTML stuff. And then we also need to figure out how I can put this on my web page. So let's see, what's the best way to figure out how to do this? Yeah, so I guess the first thing that we need to do is convert all of these rates into HTML. That's going to get put on our website. So I'm going to write up a function and I'll say convert JSON, or I guess we can just say convert to HTML. We'll have this take in our rates list, and then that will do stuff. So this will again turn our API return JSON rates into HTML. So what can I do for this? Well, the first thing that we can do is figure out where we're going to put this stuff. And we've already identified a place where all this is going to go. It's all going to go into our container document, which here is a query selector with hashtag container. What does that mean? If we go back, remember that it's an empty div for now. So I can go ahead and type in my convert to HTML. Let's add in an array of rates. So remember right now, rates is a JSON. So we have return, so we have a list of all rates in JSON, or I guess JSON object of all rates in key value pairs. So remember, this guy right now is a JSON object. We want to convert that to something that's a little bit easier for us to deal with. A nice thing that we can deal with is an array. So why not add in a rates array, and we'll set this equal to all of the entries inside of rates. So let's call this object.entries, and it returns an array of the key value pair. And we'll say that this is the object entries in rates. And now we need to figure out how we can turn each item inside of our array into an HTML object. So how can what would I need to do in order to basically go, no, here, I guess we'll say turns JSON into array of key value pairs. What do I need to do to convert this array into HTML, into elements that can go into my div?
You need to use document create element, I think, on each thing in the list.
Yeah, so we'll have to do that. But I guess a little bit separate from that was, I guess, more just thinking about like what would have to do first. But you are correct. So here, let me just jot that down in, no, I guess I'll say it here. We need to iterate over our array and go element by element and make each element of the array a HTML object. So what we are going to have to do is basically go through our array and say that our rates array dot for each, and then we're going to have to turn each of those key value pairs into some sort of HTML element. So for our HTML element, we'll have to write a new function, which is exactly what Philip was alluding to. So let's make a function. We can call it create elements, let's say, and we'll take in a rate pair, and we need to turn that rate pair into an HTML element on our web page. So the first thing that we're going to have to do, which is exactly as Philip said, is create a new div object for our element to live in. So we can say like const element div is going to be a document dot create element, and the type of element that I'm going to create is a brand new div. Now, our div has two parts, remember. So if we go back to what we wanted, I think we can just utate this actually. So we have the currency and the exchange rate. But we need a way to output both of these things. So what we might as well do is we can specify that our element div has an inner text, and we can say our inner text is going to be the rate pair, and we can say that the class name, and why do I need to set the class name? Well, because the class name is what gives us these very pretty properties here. Nope. Let me comment from here. There we go. So if we set the class name of each div thing as an item, what this does, which is again code from the README, I'll just go through it a little bit more in detail, is it says for everything that has the class name of item, I want you to give it a background color and a border and some nice padding. And whenever you hover over that, it's going to change the background color to hot pink. What does that mean for us? Well, if I set the class name of each div to be item, it will automatically give every single div I create new that property. So every single, I guess, key value, every single pair of currency and exchange rate that I create, when it gets pushed up to our HTML page, it will have this lovely little property, which is perfect. That's exactly what we'd like. So, oh, I guess we should also probably fill this in here. We should say that the elements in our array also need to be created. So, okay, we have our element div. We're creating a new element, but we have one problem. Our div doesn't currently live in our HTML page. I mean, sure, we said, all right, in the document, create a new div element, give it, this inner text and this class name. But how do I push my element to my HTML page? And more specifically, how do I make sure that that new element I create is inside of my brand new container? What do I have to do?
Append the child.
Okay, how do I do that?
I guess you need to know the ID or something for div, right?
Okay, so we got that all the way at the top here. So remember, we've got our container, which is the specific div object that we want to push into. So if I give you that specific div object, how can I append my new thing to it? What do I have to type?
Just dot append child and then div.
Perfect. Or in this case, we'd be doing lmdiv because we want to push up the specific object. But yeah, nice work, Ken. And let's see if there's anything else that that we honestly need to do. So if we go to the top again, we've got our HTML placeholders up here. We've got our base URL. We have a function that takes in our user input. Once it takes in that user input, it turns it into an API call. We then call that API. We wait for it to come back. We turn whatever response object it gives us into a result. And then that result gets turned into a list, a JSON object of rates. That object of rates then gets turned into an array. Then that array, for each item in that array, we're going to run this create element function, which then creates a new div element for us. It gives an inner text, and it says that all of these are items, which means they have that nice pretty property that we set up in our CSS. And then we can append it to our HTML using that last step. So let's go ahead and see how this works in practice. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh my page now. Hopefully nothing breaks. I'm going to go select USD and interesting. Nothing seems to be showing up. Does anybody have any idea why nothing looks like it's showing up?
Is it because you have a bunch of variables being declared inside of functions, and then you're trying to use them outside the function?
That could be part of it. Maybe. What other ideas do we have?
Maybe we're not targeting the div correctly that's in the HTML document.
That could also be it. Any other ideas?
Is it because you're not declaring rate pair anywhere?
Don't think so. That should be declared because of this guy. And also, this is not a trick question. I'm actually debugging this at the exact same time because I wrote this code 3 hours ago and tested it and it worked. And I'm very confused as to why it's not. But more than likely, it's probably a typo.
I followed along with you and mine works, so
Okay. Well, actually, in that case, no, I'm going to invite you to share your screen real quick because if you'd like to show us that it works, because there's one thing that doesn't work about it that I've specifically made to not work, and I want to see if we can figure out why.
Yeah, it's weird because I followed along too and mine's not working, so I don't know.
All right, cool. So it looks like yours is working pretty well. So no, what I'd like you to do is go where you have USD right now in the on the web page. Click that and click it to EUR.
it did it underneath. It just appended a new child.
Yeah, weird. Is that necessarily the behavior that we want to happen?
No.
So how do we stop that from happening? If we go back to the JavaScript, and anybody feel free to chime in on this because this is something that's pretty important. So if we look at what our function is doing when we're converting stuff to HTML, oh, actually, hang on, wait, I think I might have just figured out the problem that why it wasn't working on my end.
Okay.
Probably because I did not include what you have on line 33, which would probably do the trick.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, let me just make sure. Yeah, that turned out that was the issue. But we'll stick with your screen for now because you've got a working solution. So everybody inside of your make request function, make sure that you're actually calling convert to HTML. Otherwise, it won't actually output anything. And this is why keeping track of your function calls is important. But so back to the, I guess we could say, problem that we're having. We really shouldn't be appending more objects to the end of our div, because I mean, no, imagine if you should switch between USD, then EUR, then GBP, then who knows what else. At the end of the day, you're gonna have like 1,000 div elements on your page. That's gonna be awful. So we need to figure out how to change that. So let's talk about what our code is doing. So going from like the first function on down, if you wouldn't mind scrolling up to the first function, Noel. Yeah, perfect. So the first thing that's happening is when you click UR, for example, it's going to create an event listener. It's going to say, hey, I saw this thing change to EUR. The user input EUR. So I'm going to go say, send EUR to make request. Now make request is going to say, hey, I now detect that there's user input. I'm going to run an API call using that user input, going to fetch a bunch of stuff, decode everything that I've fetched into a nicer JSON format. And then after that, turn that into the rates. And I'm going to convert all my rates to HTML. Then when we go down to convert to HTML, we create an array of rates. And then for each thing in our array of rates, we create an element. Then when we create an element, and trust me, the story is nearly done. When we create an element, I'm going to create a brand new div, set the properties for that div, and then I'm going to append it to the container. Now, do we ever clear the value of the container or like remove any of the other stuff? That's like all of this, because we need to remove all of this stuff before we append new data. Otherwise, we're just going to keep appending forever, right? So how and where do we want to clear the old data before we push up new data?
Do we want to do it in the add event listener when it makes the change inside that E function thing?
We could do it there. But is that necessarily the best place to, or think about what we're doing, like think about each step. Is it the best idea to clear the existing output the moment that we get user input?
Maybe not.
Probably not. Like it seems like, imagine if like the server that you're going to access takes like a whole minute to pull data in. You still want to show your user something. So it's better that at least for while you're getting that user input, it still shows some data on the screen. So, all right, the next option, which is what Demand is referring to in the chat, is doing it in our make request. But does it necessarily make the most sense to clear our existing output when we don't even have anything to output onto it yet? Probably not. So then we move on to our convert to HTML function, which is where we start creating the things that we're going to push up onto our main web page. Now that might be a little bit of a better place to clear all of the existing output, because I mean, now we're creating the new data. So when out with the old, in with the new. So Noel, on maybe line 38, if you wouldn't mind making a new line, yeah, that'll work. And what we need to do now is figure out how to clear everything inside our original div. How do we do that?
Could you just do like container dot inner HTML equals that?
Perfect. That should work. And I know Damon said the exact same thing in chat. So yeah, nice work, both of you guys. So you'll see here, again, your USD, it works perfectly. If you go to EUR now, it replaces the whole thing. And it doesn't exactly replace it per se, but basically it's going to blank the whole thing out and then append new stuff to it. So if you're wondering why your website wasn't updating before or kept appending to the end, the reason is because you never told it to wipe everything off. So in our case, when we want to, remember, if you want to replace user data or you want to replace data on your screen, make sure to blank out the HTML in there first before appending new stuff. All right, so that's about it for part 1 of the lecture. Noel, feel free to stop sharing your screen whenever you'd like.
I got one question in regards
Go
to
for it, Ken.
that. So every time we run that function and select a new value, like a USD or euro, it's creating a new div element, correct?
Kind of. So here, let's hop into VS Code and just see what's going on one more time. So every time that we select a new value, it's going to run the event listener. So that doesn't the event listener itself doesn't create a new div.
So
What
I'm
does
just talking
create
about like overall, like once the whole thing runs, like that's the whole thing with the append child, right?
Yeah, so the append child part will create new subdivs. So here, we can go to the browser and we can see exactly what this thing looks like. So if I go type EUSD, each of these elements that's created is just a subdiv. And we can see this if we go to our inspect element. So I'll go here, we can go to our div ID container, and we see here we just have a bunch of smaller subdivs inside of it. They've got all of these little items. That's all that it does.
Do the euro one again.
Sure. So we can go to EUR.
Scroll down on your elements thing.
Oh, this guy? Yep.
Yeah, I guess my only question, and it looks like they do just disappear, is
Yeah.
if we're appending a child, I thought for whatever reason all those divs would stick around.
Yep. So ordinarily they would stick around, but the reason they don't is because we wipe all the divs off the face of the earth when we do this container.inner HTML is blank. So
Okay.
yeah, because so remember, if we go back here, the inner HTML inside of this guy are all of those subdivs that you saw. So all of like the old currency data that was there, that all lives inside of this guy. When we say that I want to set the inner HTML to be blank, that basically says all those subdivs that I created before, gone. And then we're basically appending to a blank list, which is basically just creating a brand new thing.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
In order to get mine to work, I have to convert to HRML. I don't know what's going on with that.
Huh. Okay. So, well, I guess before we jump into your example tomorrow, does anybody else have any questions? And then if not, we'll let you guys take, let's say, a 10-minute break, and we'll come back at 7:15. And then tomorrow, if you want to maybe like share your screen, we can look at what's going on there.
Yeah.
On to go for. All right, so to recap, everything that we just did right now gives us this very lovely website where we can select our currency. I can say I want stuff in US dollars, I can get it in euros, and I can get it in Great British pounds, which is awesome. But what is a EUR? What is a GPB? What is a USD? We have no idea. It would be really nice if we could put some sort of symbol along with the very long text strings here so we can see, well, what currency we're looking at instead of just a 3-letter identifier. So Chad has done something really handy for us, which is he's made a Docker application that we can use to do exactly this. So if we go to our week 8, day 1, and you guys look in the additional requirements, you're going to have to run, if you'd like to follow along, they'll be running a Docker image at this link. Or if you're on a Mac with an M1 chip, you need to run the exact same thing, but with an M1 on the end. So hopefully everybody either has done that or is doing that right now. So once you guys do that, then again, as it says here, this will run a node server that you can access on your machine. So if you look at my command prompt, don't worry about the first call, that doesn't matter. But the second one, where I run this Docker run RM and I run it with Chad Mowbray symbols, I get this really long confirmation link. It basically says, all right, this thing is running successfully on this port because I didn't get any error responses. So we can confirm that it runs if I open up my local host, and that should be right here. And I'm trying to get the symbol for, I think this is maybe Yemen, the currency, but I'm not sure. And it says here the symbol is a real. Similarly here, we can put in a symbol for a euro, and it gives us the nice symbol for a euro. We can put in GBP, and it gives us the symbol for a Great British Pound, and so on and so forth. So we now have a second, it's not exactly, it's pretty similar to an API that runs on your local machine that we can access to via this node server. So if we go back to our JavaScript demo code, let's go ahead and add something that will get our, in addition to just getting the currency exchange rates from the base, that'll also get the specific sign or relating to each code. So we need to first do the exact same thing. We're going to have to set up a base URL. So I'm going to change this from a currency API base. We'll say that this is symbol. Yeah, we'll say symbol API base. And then we'll change the link of the symbol to be, we can go here and we'll take this guy. And remember that we don't want to include anything after the equal sign. You want that in there. And remember that we need to have our Docker server running. Right now, our container, our image is running because I got that confirmation link and I just tried accessing it here. Otherwise, that endpoint will not work. So once we've got our new symbol API base in there, again, see here it says our value's never been read, which is fine because we're not going to use this right away. So we've got functions for our user input to get the API call. We're able, but now we probably need to figure out where to write our function somewhere in here. So the goal is, again, if we go back here, I want to say that this is euros, and then I've got all my stuff, and then I want to put the exact number of euros that this is using the euro sign, or the dollar sign, or the Japanese yen sign, etc. So let's figure out how to do that. So again, I've got my base URL for, I'm going to call this an API. It isn't exactly, but it's pretty similar. So I've got my base URL for this. We'll go through the exact same steps. So we can go, let's see, what's probably the best place to do it? We'll probably need to write a function that does something with create element that will get the specific symbol for our element. So we can write a new function. Let's say we can say get symbol from currency code. So we can say this function is going to be called get symbol. We can have it take in a code, and we just need to figure out now how to get the symbol from this. So this will look pretty similar to our make request function. So because of that, because we're calling something using fetch, we have to use the asynchronous function. So when we do that, we can get our, again, we can just copy all of this over, honestly. Nope, didn't mean to delete that. There we go. So we'll just delete some of the console, or we can keep those. So instead of the Oh, I guess we also need a URL now. So we could say that like the constant, what did I call this? Symbol API base. We could like symbol URL is going to be our symbol API base plus the code that we input. And we get our result doing the exact same thing. But this time, instead of coming from the API base, it's coming from our Docker image. So we're going to await the fetch for it. We can get the status. We can get the original thing. We can then get our result JSON. Oh, and you know what? Let's do that. Let's get our result JSON. And for right now, well, we're not going to keep this in there. And let's say whenever I create an element, then I want to run this function. So let's do that right now. So let's say I'm going to go when I have created my element div, we'll just say console, or we'll do get symbol, and we'll get the symbol using element div 0. Now, why am I using element div 0? Because remember here, our element divs are going to be arrays of key value pairs. The key is going to be 0, or index 0, the value is going to be index 1. So if we go to my browser here, we rerun this and go to my inspect element, we don't see anything there. And I go to USD, get nothing showing up right now. If we go back to the code here, that's why. Here, rate pair. Okay, let's try refreshing that. Let's go here. Perfect. There we go. So we see now that after the code that I just wrote says whenever I create a brand new element in my div, I want to get the symbol corresponding to the code of the thing that I'm writing. So handy little test just to make sure. So euros, yeah, the symbol is a funny looking E. $, yep, the symbol for USD is a $. Symbol for yen is a Y with some lines through it, and so on. So this is essentially a functional test to make sure that our API works. So that's great. Now, the last thing that we should probably do is look at our JSON and figure out how do we go from this key value pair to actually getting the value on the other side of this. So if we look in there, we see the only key is symbol. So what we should just be able to do is say const, actually, I guess we could just return it. We could just return the result JSON dot symbol. Because, I mean, that's basically just going to be the thing inside of here. And we don't need that. And we don't need that either. Okay, so now that we have our symbol, so if we, now let's say we console log the result of running get symbol on each of these, and I refresh this, we go switch to USD, we now switch over to a bunch of promises. Why are they promises? Because we aren't doing anything with them. So in order to actually do something with our promises, we have the result, which is the euro, and that's the thing that needs to be pushed up to our web page. So in order to get those, I'm going to change this from a console log to we need to wait for the symbol to finish processing. So we have to add in an await. We'll say returns promise because async function. So you could say await turns promise into actual thing, or I guess to be more specific, actual string that we can use. So we could say const rate symbol, and now we're going to await this get symbol. But wait, await isn't working. Why is it not working? Because await expressions are only allowed within async functions. Okay, so then we have to change our create element function into an asynchronous function because of the await. And then the last thing that we should do is now we can create basically the JavaScript version of an F string. So we'll use a backtick and then a $, and then we can just put in a rate pair, and we can also add in our rate symbol. And that should be good to go. So if we go back to our code now, and I refresh this, and we'll walk through what this thing is doing. So what did we just do? Well, as you can see, it's working perfectly. I mean, it puts out the symbols, and at the same time, it also still has all the API data from before. But what did we do in order to have this happen? Well, first we have to have our Docker server running, or our Docker instance running, which it is. As we can see here, I haven't quit it. We have to access it using a link base, just like we did for the currencies API. Then we need to write a function, just like our make request function that gets the API call. We also need to write one that makes our call to our Docker instance and turns that code that we wrote, that code that we have input, into a symbol by getting it back. And again, here we have it as being returned. However, because it's an asynchronous function, when it returns, it's going to return a promise, and we can't really deal with promises. The only way that we can deal with a promise is when we await the result of that function. So by awaiting the result of get symbol, it turns that promise into an actual string. But when we turn it into an actual string, an await necessitates that it be inside of an asynchronous function. So we pop on an async, and then we're done. So, and I know that this one was a little bit more brief than the other, like half of the unit that we covered, but are there any questions about running things in Docker, or why we need to add in the asyncs and awaits in this specific instance, or the string interpolation, or just why this works?
So is the Docker basically just holding the information in the form of a JSON?
Yes and no. So the Docker thing is basically running, it's basically running an API on your local computer. And then it's what, in response to whatever you're putting in that API, it's giving you JSON back.
Cool. And that's why like I guess the API call is local host and not some like HTTP whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. And if you go into your console, you can set which port you want it to run on. So here I've set that I want it to run on port 9888, which is what I'm specifying in here. And again, this is something I downloaded on my computer with Docker run. And it says when I do this, I run it on I take this thing from Chad's Docker, download it to my computer, and then run it on my local machine on that port.
Is picking the port number just kind of a crapshoot, or is there like a method?
I believe that this is the standard port for running Docker things. You can pick your own, but from my understanding, there's generally like standard ports that you run for every single application. So like some will run on port like 1234, others will run on port 200, some will run on port like 1000, etc. So it's usually application by application dependent.
Cool.
And yeah, as Tiffany said, some ports are going to be in use. You can pick whichever one. When we get into databases with SQL, for example, SQL will automatically run on a specific port. But if that port is being used right now, then it'll switch over to another port automatically, for example, stuff like that. So you can pick it arbitrarily, but it's just best practice to stick with certain defaults for certain applications.
Isn't it like 5432 or something?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, mine runs on 5433 for whatever reason.
Well, that's probably because 5432 was taken. That's the only reason why I would run on another port. Any other questions about any of the stuff we talked about?
Omar, can you post your code on Slacker for us?
Sure. Yeah, I can upload it to Slack right after this.
Thank you.